These days, my apartment sounds like a home should sound. Small footsteps padding across the kitchen tile, a baby's laugh carrying down the hallway, the particular chaos of a life with people in it instead of just me and the hum of the refrigerator. A year ago, I couldn't have imagined any of it. A year ago, I was the quiet superintendent everyone in the building nodded to in the elevator and forgot about the second the doors closed. I didn't know yet that fixing a leaking faucet for a stranger crying in 4 bites would end up filling every quiet corner of my life. I only knew, standing in that hallway the first night, that something about her voice made me stop and actually listen. My name is Owen Marsh. I'm 33, and I've worked as the building superintendent at the Ashford Court Apartments in Chicago for almost 9 years. Ever since I dropped out of a business program I never much wanted in the first place. My mother raised me alone after my father left when I was 6, working 2 jobs to keep us afloat, and I grew up watching her exhaustion, her quiet fear every time a bill came due. I promised myself early on that I'd never let a family depend on me the way my father let ours depend on him and then simply didn't show up. Somewhere along the way, that promise turned into something closer to avoidance. I fixed leaky pipes and broken heaters for 200 tenants over the years, but I never let myself get close enough to anyone in the building to risk becoming someone they needed. Easier that way, I told myself. Fewer people to disappoint. My mother worked as a hotel housekeeper by day and cleaned offices downtown at night, coming home most evenings too exhausted to do more than sit at the kitchen table, with her shoes still on, staring at nothing in particular. I used to bring her tea without being asked. The only comfort a 9-year-old could offer a woman, carrying a weight no child should ever fully understand. I promised myself early on that I'd never let a family depend on me the way my father let ours depend on him, and then simply didn't show up. Grace Whitfield moved into apartment 4 bites 8 months ago, quiet and polite in the hallway. The kind of tenant who paid rent early and never called with complaints. Before the flood, Grace and I had exchanged little more than polite nods in the mailroom. The occasional comment about the weather while she waited for the elevator with a bag of groceries balanced on one hip. I remembered noticing, in passing, how carefully she scheduled her errands to avoid the building's busiest hours, like she preferred moving through her days unnoticed. I hadn't thought much of it until the night everything changed. I noticed her mostly in passing, until the night in March when her kitchen sink backed up bad enough to flood halfway across her floor. I knocked, expecting the usual apologetic tenant. Instead, I found a woman sitting on her kitchen floor, one hand pressed against a stomach round enough to leave no question about what she was carrying, crying in a way that told me the flooded sink was the smallest problem in her night. "I'm sorry," she said, wiping her face fast when she saw me in the doorway. "The water. I tried to stop it, I just—" "Forget the water," I said, kneeling down beside her. "You okay?" She let out a short, broken laugh. "No, not really." She pressed both hands to her stomach. "My boyfriend left 3 weeks ago, the same week I told him I was pregnant. Said he wasn't ready, packed a bag, and I haven't heard from him since. My mother's not speaking to me because I won't do what my father wants. And now my kitchen's flooding, and I just—" Her voice cracked. "I don't know how to do any of this alone." I didn't have a smooth answer ready. I just reached over, shut off the water valve under her sink, and said, "Let's get this fixed first. Then we can talk about the rest if you want to." She nodded, wiping her eyes again, and something about the way she let herself be careful and a little embarrassed, stuck with me long after I'd finished the repair and left her apartment that night. Over the following weeks, I found small reasons to check on 4 bites more than any maintenance schedule required. A dripping faucet here, a loose cabinet hinge there. Excuses that got thinner each time, even as Grace seemed to notice and appreciate them anyway. She started leaving her door propped when she heard my footsteps in the hallway, offering me tea, telling me pieces of her life in the unhurried way people do when they've decided, slowly, that someone might actually be safe to talk to. One evening, over tea, she insisted on making, despite my protest that I'd only come to check a leaky faucet. "Grace told me about Adrian. The way you tell someone a story you've rehearsed too many times in your own head already." They dated almost 2 years, comfortable in the easy way relationships get when neither person examines them too closely. When she told him about the pregnancy, he went quiet for 3 full days before packing a single suitcase and moving in with a friend across town, sending one final text that said only that he wasn't built for this kind of responsibility. "I keep replaying it," she admitted, wrapping both hands around her mug, wondering what I could have said differently to make him stay. "Nothing," I said. A man who leaves the moment things get hard was never going to stay through the hard parts later, either. You didn't fail to say the right thing. He failed to be the right person. She looked at me like she hadn't expected such plain certainty from a man who barely knew the whole story yet. You say things so directly. Truth's usually simpler than the excuses people build to avoid it, I said, and something about the words settled between us, quiet and true. Her father, Richard Whitfield, ran a prominent law firm downtown. The kind of man used to controlling every outcome in his orbit through sheer force of expectation. When Grace told her parents she was pregnant and that Adrian, the baby's father, had left, Richard's response wasn't comfort. It was an ultimatum. He wants me to move back home, Grace told me one evening, sitting at her kitchen table while I fixed a wobbly cabinet door. Says he'll take care of everything, the pregnancy, the baby, all of it, if I agree to certain conditions. What conditions? I asked. A closed adoption, she said quietly. He says an unmarried daughter with a baby doesn't fit the image he's built for the firm. For our family name. He's already looking into agencies. He keeps saying it's what's best for everyone. Something cold settled in my stomach. What do you want? She looked at me, surprised by the directness of the question, like nobody had asked her that plainly in weeks. I want to keep her, she said, resting a hand on her stomach. I don't care how hard it is. I just don't know how to do it without my family's support. And I don't have Adrian, and I don't have much money saved. And every time I think about doing this completely alone, I feel like the walls are closing in. You're not doing it alone, I said, before I'd fully decided to say it. Not unless you want to. She studied my face a long moment, something cautious and hopeful both fighting for space in her expression. You barely know me, Owen. I know enough, I said. I know you've spent 8 months paying rent early and keeping to yourself. And the one time you actually needed help, you apologized for the water instead of asking for it outright. That tells me you're used to carrying things alone, that you shouldn't have to. Something in her face softened, and for the first time since I'd met her, she let herself cry a little without immediately apologizing for it. The first time I drove her to a prenatal appointment, sitting in the waiting room, flipping through an outdated magazine while Grace disappeared behind the exam room door, I realized how naturally I'd started slipping into a role nobody had officially assigned me. When she came back out, ultrasound photo in hand, she held it out to me before she even looked at it herself. "Wanna see?" she asked, something shy in the offer. I studied the grainy image a long moment. A small curled shape that would soon be a whole entire person. She's going to be lucky, I said quietly, having a mother who fights this hard for her already. Grace's eyes filled, and she didn't try to hide it that time. Over the following months, our arrangement grew slowly into something neither of us named right away. I started coming by most evenings, sometimes to fix something small, sometimes with no excuse at all beyond wanting to see how her day had gone. I drove her to her prenatal appointments when her usual rideshare canceled twice in 1 week. I assembled the crib she'd ordered online, following instructions that made no sense until Grace, laughing for the first time in what she said felt like weeks, took over and finished it herself in half the time. "You're better at this than me?" I admitted, watching her tighten the last bolt with more confidence than I'd managed in 20 minutes of frustration. "I've had a lot of practice assembling things that come with confusing instructions and no guarantee they'll hold together," she said. "Feels oddly familiar." I laughed, surprised by how easily it came, and something in my chest tightened at the sound of her laughing back. One of the older tenants, Mistress Alvarez, in 2C cornered me in the laundry room one afternoon, eyes sharp with the particular knowingness of a woman who'd lived through her own share of complicated love. "You've been smiling in the hallways lately," she said, folding towels with brisk efficiency. "9 years I've watched you fix things around here, like a man allergic to his own life. Whatever's changed, don't let it slip past you out of habit." I didn't have a ready answer for her, but her words followed me up the stairs that evening, settling somewhere I couldn't quite shake. I called my mother that same week, something I hadn't done with any real purpose in months. She listened quietly while I told her about Grace, about the baby, about the strange, growing certainty that I wanted to be present for all of it, despite every instinct telling me to keep my distance the way I always had. "Your father's leaving taught you the wrong lesson, Owen," she said gently. "It taught you that loving someone means eventually disappointing them. But staying isn't about being perfect. It's about choosing to show up again the next day, even when it's hard. I stayed for you every single day, even the exhausted ones. That's what love actually looks like." Her words sat with me for days afterward, quietly rearranging something I'd carried since childhood, without ever fully examining it. One evening in May, after a long day helping her repaint the nursery, a soft, pale green. We sat on her small balcony overlooking the city, 2 glasses of lemonade, sweating between us. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Go ahead. Why do you keep showing up? You don't owe me any of this. Fixing my sink was your job. Everything since then hasn't been." I hesitated, because the honest answer went further than I'd planned to admit yet. "Because somewhere in the last 2 months, checking on you stopped feeling like part of my job and started feeling like the best part of my day," I said quietly. "And because I know what it's like to grow up watching someone you love carry an impossible weight alone. I watched my mother do it for years after my father left. I told myself a long time ago I'd never let that happen to anyone again, not while I had 2 working hands and enough sense to use them." Grace's eyes filled. "Your father left you both?" "When I was 6, I said. "I've spent most of my adult life avoiding getting close enough to anyone that they'd need me, the way we needed him, in case I turned out just as unreliable." I paused, surprised, set by my own honesty. "But somewhere in these last 2 months, I stopped being afraid of that with you." She reached over and took my hand, her fingers cool against mine. "I'm scared too," she admitted. "Scared of raising her alone. Scared of my father's threats. Scared of trusting anyone again after Adrian." She looked at me. "But I'm not scared of you, Owen, not even a little." Neither of us said anything else for a long moment, the city lights flickering below us. Something unspoken but understood settling quietly into place between us. One Saturday in early June, I took Grace to the small farmer's market 2 blocks from Ashford Court. Something she'd mentioned wanting to see, but had been too anxious to visit alone. Worried about running into anyone from her father's social circle who might report back on her condition, we walked slowly between the stalls, Grace resting a hand on her stomach every so often, pausing to admire a vendor's handmade baby blankets. "I haven't done anything this normal in months," she admitted, picking out a soft yellow blanket despite her tight budget. "Everything's felt like survival lately. This feels like actually living." "Then let's do more of it," I said. "Survival's important, but it shouldn't be the only thing on the calendar." She bought the blanket, and on the walk back, she slipped her hand into mine without either of us commenting on it. Like the gesture had become natural faster than either of us had noticed. I carried the moment with me the rest of that day, quietly amazed at how easily this had all started feeling less like helping a neighbor and more like building a life. 2 weeks later, Richard Whitfield showed up at the Ashford Court, unannounced, a sleek car idling in the loading zone out front, while he strode into the lobby like he owned the building outright. I was checking the mailroom locks when I heard his voice carry down the hall, sharp and commanding. "Grace," he said, finding her in the lobby where she'd come down to collect a package. "I've arranged a meeting with the adoption agency for Thursday. This has gone on long enough. You cannot possibly manage a baby in this building, working part-time, with no husband and no real income." "I'm not giving her up, Dad," Grace said, voice shaking but steady. "I've told you that already." "And how exactly do you plan to support a child?" Richard pressed. "On a receptionist's salary, in a 2-bedroom rental, with some building superintendent playing house because he feels sorry for you?" I stepped forward from the mailroom, close enough that Richard finally acknowledged I existed. "She's not playing anything," I said evenly. "And you might want to check the tone you're using with your daughter before you lose the chance to be part of this at all." Richard looked me over the way men like him always size up anyone he considers beneath his notice. "And you are?" "The man who's actually shown up for the last 2 months," I said. "Where were you when her sink flooded and she was sitting on the kitchen floor crying? 3 weeks pregnant and alone." Something flickered across Richard's face, quick and defensive. "I offered her a solution." "You offered her an ultimatum," I said. "That's not the same thing as support." Richard's jaw tightened, and for a second I saw past the polish to something colder underneath. He turned back to Grace. "If you insist on keeping this child without proper support, don't expect the firm's resources or my name attached to whatever mess follows. I won't have my grandchild raised in some rented apartment above a boiler room." "You think a rented apartment above a boiler room is a home?" Richard added, before turning to leave. "You're setting my granddaughter up for the same instability you clearly can't rise above yourself." "Funny," I said. "I've lived in this building 9 years without missing a single rent payment or walking out on anyone who needed me. I can't say the same about the man threatening to cut off his own daughter for refusing an ultimatum." He turned and walked out, the lobby doors swinging shut hard behind him. Grace stood frozen, one hand pressed to her stomach, the other trembling at her side. "He means it," she said quietly. "He'll cut me off completely. No more help with insurance, no more emergency fund, nothing. Then we figure out what you actually need without him," I said. "Whatever that takes." That same week, I sat down with Grace and worked through her budget line by line. The way I'd once helped my mother stretch a paycheck further than it had any right to go, we found places to cut. A subscription she'd forgotten she was paying for. A cheaper insurance plan through the building's group policy I'd never mentioned to tenants before, because nobody had ever asked. It wasn't a solution to everything, but it was something solid. Something built with our own hands instead of borrowed from Richard's conditional generosity. You didn't have to know how to do any of this, Grace said, watching me work through the spreadsheet. Landlords don't usually double as financial advisors. Superintendents fix what's broken, I said. Didn't seem right to only fix the pipes and let everything else stay leaking. She laughed, tired but genuine, and reached over to squeeze my hand. A week later, Grace's reduced hours at the law office became official. A decision delivered by an apologetic office manager who admitted, off the record, that a senior partner close to Richard had suggested the change. Grace sat with the news for a long while before finally saying, quiet and resolute, I'm done letting his influence decide what I'm allowed to have. I'm going to find something entirely my own. Within a month, she'd landed a remote bookkeeping position with a small nonprofit, one with no ties whatsoever to her father's circle. And the relief on her face the day she accepted it told me everything about how much that independence mattered. The following weeks tested that resolve harder than either of us expected. Grace's part-time hours at the law office where she'd been working got quietly reduced. A decision she suspected, without proof, traced back to her father's influence with the firm's partners. Her mother called twice, tearful, but unwilling to defy Richard openly, each call leaving Grace more drained than before. One evening, I found her sitting on the nursery floor, staring at the half-finished crib, tears sliding down her face. Maybe he's right, she said. Maybe I can't actually do this. That's exhaustion talking, I said. Not the truth. How would you know? She snapped, then immediately looked stricken. I'm sorry. I just don't know how many more nights I can spend afraid of my own father. I sat down on the floor beside her, close enough that our shoulders touched. You don't have to be afraid alone, I said. I know you're used to carrying this by yourself, believing nobody sturdy enough would actually stay. But I'm not going anywhere, Grace. She looked up at me, disbelief and exhaustion both warring in her expression. Why do you keep saying things like that? Because it's true, I said simply. And because I finally understand that avoiding the risk of disappointing someone isn't the same as protecting them. I've been avoiding exactly that for 25 years. I don't want to avoid it with you. Her breath caught. Neither of us moved for a long moment. The paint-scented nursery quiet around us. Owen, she whispered, I can't lose this baby to a system my father can manipulate with a phone call. You won't, I said, and this time I meant it as a promise, not comfort. Grace's mother, Eleanor, visited quietly one afternoon while Richard was away on business, bringing a bag of secondhand baby clothes she'd bought without telling her husband. She sat stiffly at the kitchen table at first, clearly uncomfortable, defying Richard even in this small way, but softened as the visit went on, asking careful questions about names, about the nursery, about how Grace was truly holding up beneath the surface the calm she presented to the world. He loves you, Eleanor said quietly before she left. He just doesn't know how to love you without also controlling the outcome. I'm sorry I haven't been braver about standing between the two of you. You're here now, Grace said, hugging her mother tight at the door. That matters more than you think. Grace went into labor 6 weeks later, 3 weeks earlier than expected, in the middle of a Tuesday night thunderstorm. I drove her to the hospital with more nerves than I'd expected to feel, holding her hand through 12 hours of labor while nurses moved in and out and the storm rattled the windows outside. The contractions started just after midnight, and by the time I got her to the hospital, the storm outside had turned the streets into rivers, thunder rattling the windows every few minutes like the whole sky was announcing the occasion. Grace gripped my hand through each wave of pain, and somewhere around hour 8, exhausted and scared despite her best attempts to hide it, she looked at me and said, Talk to me about anything. I just need to hear a voice that isn't a monitor beeping. So I told her about my mother, about the hotel room she used to clean before dawn, about the tea I used to bring her without being asked. I told her about the promise I'd made as a boy, and the version of it I was still learning to rewrite. Grace listened between contractions, gripping my hand tighter at the parts that clearly meant something to her. And somewhere in that long, storm-lit night, I understood I'd already decided this wasn't a temporary arrangement. It hadn't been for months. When her daughter, Lily, finally arrived, small and furious and perfect, Grace looked up at me with tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she said, "for every single day since that flooded sink." "I'm not finished yet," I said, smiling despite the exhaustion in my own bones. Richard showed up at the hospital the next morning, stiff and formal, clearly having heard the news through Grace's mother despite the silence between them. He stood at the doorway of Grace's room, looking at his granddaughter for the first time. Something unreadable crossing his face. "She's beautiful," he said finally, voice quieter than I'd heard from him before. "She is," Grace said carefully. "And she's staying with me. Not the agency, not anywhere else, with me, and with Owen." Richard was quiet a long moment, studying the baby. Then his daughter's face, resolute, despite the exhaustion still etched into it. "I was wrong to threaten you," he said, the words clearly costing him something significant to admit. "I thought controlling the outcome would protect the family name. I didn't consider that it might cost me my daughter and granddaughter instead." He looked at me, something almost like respect flickering in his expression. "You've shown more consistency in 2 months than most men manage in years." "I plan to keep it that way," I said. Richard nodded once, a small concession. And though the relationship between him and Grace would take considerably longer to fully repair, that morning marked the first honest step toward it, in months. 6 months after Lily's birth, my apartment above the boiler room, the one Richard had once dismissed so easily, had become something neither Grace nor I had expected to build so quickly. Grace and Lily moved in properly that spring, filling rooms that had sat quiet and purposeless for 9 years with the particular, wonderful chaos only a baby brings. Mistress Alvarez took to babysitting some afternoons so Grace could pick up a few extra hours at a new job she'd found, one entirely outside Richard's professional orbit, something she'd built on her own credentials instead of her father's connections. The tenants in the building had grown fond of seeing Lily in her stroller during my rounds. Several of them leaving small gifts outside our door just to see her smile. I finally repainted my own apartment that summer, something I hadn't bothered doing in 9 years of living there alone. Grace picked a warm cream color for the living room, said the place had earned something less like a bachelor's afterthought and more like an actual home. We hung a small shelf near the door for Lily's growing collection of stuffed animals, and I found myself standing in front of it some evenings, quietly amazed at how full the space had become in less than a year. Richard visited twice that autumn, awkward but genuine, bringing small gifts and staying longer each time. Watching Grace with Lily like a man slowly relearning how to be present instead of controlling. He never fully apologized in the direct way Grace might have wanted, but the effort itself, consistent and humble in ways I hadn't expected from him, spoke its own kind of apology neither of them needed to name outright. One evening, rocking Lily to sleep while Grace finished paperwork at the kitchen table, I thought back to that flooded kitchen floor, to the woman crying alone with nowhere she felt she could turn. I thought about my own mother, about the promise I'd made as a boy never to let anyone depend on me the way we depended on a man who simply walked away. I understood now that the promise had needed rewriting all along. It was never about refusing to be needed. It was about making sure that when someone finally did need me, I'd actually be there. I walked over to Grace, kissed the top of her head, and said quietly, "I meant what I told you the night Richard came to the lobby. Not anymore. I'm here. Every version of here for as long as you'll let me." She looked up at me, eyes soft in the evening light. "Every version of here," she repeated. "I think I finally believe that. Some promises get made once and broken the first time they're tested. Others get renewed quietly, every single ordinary evening, until neither person needs to ask whether they'll still be true tomorrow. Ours became the second kind, and I never once regretted the flooded sink that started it all.